to the English-speaking virtual tasting. Those of you who've been with us on this journey will notice that I'm back in the office, which is fantastic because that means that we're slowly beginning to open up. We've got a level 3 exam taking place on Saturday. I know some of you are preparing for that very hard. We have a level 2 course going on next week. So we're incredibly excited to be back working and being able to bring courses to you in person as well as virtually. So as you know, the aim of this session is to keep your tasting skills honed and look at the level 2 and level 3 systematic approach to tasting as prescribed by the Wine and Spirits Education Trust. And really what we're trying to do is think about connecting the theory that you learn about in your classes with the things that you can taste in the glass. So every week we'll do a little bit of discussion about the theory, the growing technique, maybe the soils, the climate, these influences on the grapes, as well as the grapes themselves. And then also the human factors, so the natural factors in the vineyard, and then the human factors in the winery that impact the wine and what we can taste and smell and discern from the wine when we're doing our tastings. So today we're looking at the Terenzi, Morellino di Scansano, 2018. I'm hoping that you can all get a clear look at that. One of the reasons that I particularly wanted to look at a Morellino was because we've already in virtual tasting explored Brunello. And although Morellino di Scansano does not have to be 100% Sangiovese, the DOCG regulation actually only asks for 85%. This is 100% Sangiovese. And I think that sometimes these wines present a good conversation piece to have after each other because of the different climatic influences. And we will talk a little bit today about what they would be, but also what impact that might have on the wine and whether we can taste that in the glass when we come to the wine. So Brunello, obviously in the heart of Tuscany on the hill, based in Montalcino on the hills. So a little bit of cooling air coming in through the coast and a little bit of altitude. Okay, so here we're expecting very high acidity wines, very persistent tannins. And we're looking for those kind of bright cherry, bright plum flavors in Brunello. In Morellino di Scansano, by contrast, we're actually in the hotter plains of Tuscany by the coast. So whilst you get some of those coastal influences, it's much flatter and much warmer. Okay, so we have the potential here for this warmer climate. So potentially more ripeness in the grapes. Remember, we talk about warmer climate influencing grape varieties by producing much riper flavors. So we'd be thinking about, instead of fresh cherry and unripe plum, maybe cooked cherry, cooked plum, ripe fruit flavors. And another thing to consider is the impact that has not only on acidity, so perhaps the acidity is going to be a little bit lower in this wine, but also particularly for Sangiovese, it's important to think about the tannic structure of the wine, because as we know, Sangiovese is a wine that has a grape variety that has potential for very high tannins. But by having this extra sunshine, this extra warmth, whilst those tannins are present, you might expect to get a little bit more refinement, riper tannins in the same way that you would get riper flavors. So this is something to consider when we taste this wine, some of the expectations we might have, and then you can have a discussion about whether that actually plays out in the glass and potentially what other factors are at play. So to give you a little bit more information about the wine, this is coming from sand and clay sites. So it's a mixture of sand and clay. So whilst you've got some water retention, it's actually free draining. So you're not worried too much about the fact that these grapevines are going to be sitting in water. In terms of what's happening in the winery, they're using stainless steel and only stainless steel. So when we talk about these primary, secondary, and tertiary characteristics when we're tasting, so remember, primary characteristics come from the grape variety, secondary characteristics come from these human factors, so these things that are happening in the winery, the winemaking choices. Here we need to consider stainless steel as your secondary. And in that case, you're not actually going to be looking for secondary characteristics in the wine. Okay? Instead, this is going to present itself as a freshness in the wine. The idea of using steel is to maintain the freshness, the potential aromatics of a grape, rather than to add flavors like you would, for example, with oak. When we talk about tertiary characteristics, we're thinking about the aging, the maturation of the wine. And in this case, it's a 2018, so obviously a little bit of time in the bottle, but shouldn't be so long as to impact the wine. And hopefully we'll be able to see that in the glass from the color, but also from the flavor. We should be thinking really about primary characteristics in this wine and what they are. Okay. They're harvesting their grapes at the end of September, which actually is relatively early for Sangiovese. Sangiovese is a late ripening grape variety. It likes a long hang time. Okay? And this is something that I want you to consider when we're tasting, in contrast to this idea of the warmer climate. Okay? Why might they be harvesting earlier? For those of you thinking about those short answer questions in the level 3 exam, might be something that comes up. By picking earlier, okay, you are lessening the sugar in the grapes. So again, potentially lessening the alcohol potential. Remember this correlation between sugar accumulation and alcoholic fermentation potential. But also you're maintaining acidity. So perhaps in this wine, although we would expect much more ripeness because of the climate, by making that decision to pick their grapes a little bit earlier, we might find that the acidity is higher than you would expect from the climate. So hopefully that gives you a little bit of background. Grab your glass and let's have a taste. So considering the color in this wine, we're not going to be expecting garnet. Remember, it's a young wine relatively. So I can see straight down through my glass, and I can see the rim. Okay, when I look straight through the glass, I can see the base of the glass very clearly. If I tilt my glass to 45 degrees, I can actually read text through the wine. I can just about read the text on my SAT. So what we have here is a pale ruby wine. Okay. Now, I know that many people find this surprising about Sangiovese, but actually it's a grape variety that even in a warm climate should never present as deep. Okay. You're always going to be within that pale medium spectrum. So pale ruby, let's have a smell. So in terms of the intensity, I talk a lot about judging intensity by how far away from the glass you are. If you're judging with level 2, remember you have this 3-point scale of light, medium, and pronounced, okay? So you're going to be looking at a medium wine in this case. For those of you working on your level 3 scale, you have a little bit more nuance. And for me, I'm just a little bit away from the rim of the glass. Remember, I talk about a true medium wine as being when you just have your nose on the rim of the glass. Here, I'm just a little bit further away when I get those clear fruit characteristics. So if you're working with level 3, this is just pushing it into that medium plus bracket. And remember, we're looking for the positive characteristics, the fruit characteristics or the winemaking characteristics, not the alcohol or anything else. And so what do I smell? As expected, it's quite a ripe red wine on the palate. So Sangiovese is all about this kind of cherry, plum, red spectrum. And in this case, they are ripe fruits. I get ripe cherry, ripe plum. I also get a little bit of cooked red plum. Just if you've been baking plums and you get that lovely kind of plummy, baked, not jammy, but with a little bit more richness. And I also get some slight aromatic herbs. And for me, again, they're in that more dried, kind of more baked character. So dried thyme, maybe rosemary, and a little bit of dried violet. So in warmer climates, you do tend to get, as well as this ripe red fruit character, a little bit of this ripe aromatic. So something like a dried violet or a dried herb is exactly what we'd expect from Sangiovese. And what I've listed are all youthful characteristics. Yeah, they're all primary characteristics, nothing coming from the winemaking or from the aging, because there hasn't been any. So for those of you working with level 3, this is still fitting in that primary category, so it's a youthful wine. So let's have a taste. And as usual, let's taste for sweetness and acidity first, and really think about what your expectations are for the acidity about this wine, because I believe it's quite surprising. So it's a completely dry wine, as you would expect. Very few people are making any kind of Sangiovese with residual sugar. And the acidity is very interesting because we know that this comes from a slightly warmer climate, but actually the acidity is much higher than you would expect potentially. Again, for those of you working on level 2, this is in your medium bracket. Okay? It's not high acidity. I'm not getting this flood of mouth watering that won't stop. Okay? But it is a little bit higher than I would expect. So if you're working with your level 3, this will fit into the medium plus category. And remember, with level 3, you're just getting that little bit more nuance when you taste. And whilst this is surprising for the climate, potentially, remember we talked about them harvesting earlier. And this is a decision in order to maintain the freshness in the wine. So I want us to taste again and think about tannin and alcohol. And if you struggle with tannins, really try and get the wine right up into your gums. Use it like mouthwash when you're tasting, because that's the best way to get the impact of the tannins on your palate. And will help maintain the tannins whilst you've got this quite high acidity, this medium plus medium acidity that's making your mouth water. To really taste the tannin and see what to expect from the tannin, do try and get it right up into your gums. It'll be helpful for you. So we know from having tasted a Brunello already in our virtual tasting, the Sangiovese is a great variety with potentially very high tannin. Here, if we're working with level 2, you're in that medium bracket. If you're working with level 3, again, you've got that option of going up to medium plus. And it is a medium plus tannin. It's not high, but the thing to note about the tannins in this wine is that they are pretty fine. They're fine and they are ripe. They're not really chunky or grippy. My mouth isn't very, very dry, but I do have that lovely tannic grip. Okay. And remember what we said about the warmth, the extra sunlight you get in this area, the influence of the climate really gives you that phenolic ripeness, gives you that ripeness of the tannins, which balanced with the acidity makes this really quite pleasant. In terms of the alcohol, it's a medium alcohol wine. There's no burn at the back of my throat. It's just noticeable that there's alcohol there. And that really is the key for judging alcohol in wine at this level. Okay? You're looking for, is the back of your throat when you inhale a little bit of air through the wine making you very, very hot? Or is it just a little warmth, just indicating that there's alcohol there, but it's not too hot? And again, this might be surprising for the DOCG with this warmer climate, but remember we're harvesting earlier here. So not only are we maintaining the acidity, but we're helping to maintain a lower alcohol level in the wine by not having too much sugar accumulation in the grapes, which gets played out by fermenting to dry. Okay. So we'll taste for body and flavor intensity. And whilst you're doing that, that's when I begin to start thinking about what the flavors are in the wine. So we're medium body straight down the line. No adjustments for your SAT at level 3, completely medium. It's got a lightness to it, which again, might be contrary to what you'd expect, but makes the wine much more refreshing. Okay. And for me, the intensity is also medium, because whilst there is some fruit concentration there, it dissipates very quickly. And for me, this is also linked to the finish. When I'm tasting for flavor intensity, I'm often also thinking about it in relation to the finish. And for me, the finish is also medium. Okay? You get this flush of fruit, and then it's just gone. Yeah? So it sticks around just a little bit, enough for you to taste it and get the different flavors, but it's not a long finish. Okay? And what are the flavors? Well, interestingly, I actually find this wine fresher on the palate than I do on the nose. On the nose, it suggests these ripe, rich flavors, these sort of dried herbs, this rich cooked plum, this ripe red cherry. On the palate, it's much fresher. So I'm looking at this kind of fresh cherry, fresh plum. There's also a slightly green character to the wine, reminiscent obviously of wines that are picked a little bit early. And for me, this expresses itself as a tomato leaf kind of character. That's quite particular, but you might just get a greenness, a slightly stalky character. If you do, and you're writing your tasting note, try and find something that you can find that equivalent with. Okay. So for me, it's a tomato leaf. For you, it might be a green herb. It might be a green vegetable. But really try and express that in your tasting note. Give the most complete note that you can for the wine, because it really helps you understand it. Okay, so I always like to give my wine one last taste before we think about the quality assessment, just to cement it in my mind. To regain that complete picture of the wine. And then we can start thinking about our quality level and our readiness for drinking. So remember, we use this tool of Blick to help us with WSET quality levels. Okay, we're talking about the balance, the length, the intensity, and the complexity of the wine. So for me, this is a well-balanced wine. The acidity makes it refreshing. It's got some intensity. It's got some tannin, but the tannin is not too chalky or grippy. Like I said, it's ripe, it's fine-grained. It doesn't have much length, but there's a little bit there. It's medium. It's not a short or medium minus finish. So I would give a partial tick in length. It has some intensity. Remember, it has a little bit more intensity on the nose than it did on the palate. And it has a little bit of complexity, but not too much. Or we're finding these red fruit characters and these herbal characters, but we're not finding lots of other things going on. Okay? So for me, this would put it into the good category. Okay? Because remember, it's not a hard and fast scale with the Blick. You have to consider it all together. So not only have you got a big tick in balance, you've got small partial ticks in all the others, which accumulate to that extra push over the line for good. Okay? And in terms of aging, drink now, but not suitable for further aging. Okay? You have to remember when you're considering the aging of wines, whether it would be improved by a period of aging. Now, we know that these fruit flavors might become moved from ripe to dried, and the herbal character might do the same thing, but actually that would lose the freshness, the appeal of the wine. You don't actually gain anything from it. The thing that makes this wine enjoyable, makes it easy to drink, is this combination of these bright, fresh fruits, a little bit of richness on the nose, and then this lovely acidity, yeah, and these ripe tannins. So that is my assessment of our Morellino di Scansano. I've liked talking about this wine because I do think it's an interesting example of Morellino, because you have these two things at play, this idea of the warmer climate, but also how the winemaker is thinking about adjusting for this warmer climate. If you don't have big moderating influences, okay, so for example, if you were in another wine region where you have strong coastal currents or you have high altitude, then you can adjust that way. But here in Morellino, we don't have those adjustments. Okay? We don't have those climatic influences in the same way. So the winemaker is making those adjustments. And that's one of the nice things that's good to talk about in these wines is not just where the influences can come in the climate, but also how you can adjust for it in the winery. Thank you so much for joining me again for this English-speaking virtual tasting with the Italian Wine Academy. I look forward to seeing those of you who are sitting the exam on Saturday for our little bit of tasting beforehand. 10:30, we'll be tasting a couple of wines to calibrate with me in person, and then we'll kick off the exam in the afternoon. For the rest of you, I'll see you next Monday for another edition of the virtual tasting.